Hello, in this video I'm going to look at a letter that Chris Watts wrote to Cheryln Cadle because it's now been, well, for the last couple of days it's been published in the media. So I'm going to look through some of the main parts of that letter, the bits that stand out to me, and look at what might have been behind them. Before I get started, I want to say a few words about Frank Ruiz, Cheryln Watts' father. He spoke on TV about the way the family has been harassed, and he spoke about YouTubers who have been slating his daughter. They've been making up lies about Cheryln Watts and spreading these across the internet, and Frank Ruiz asked that they would stop. He mentioned that he knows which YouTubers are on his side, and the emphasis was on the ones that aren't, you know, the ones that are talking about his daughter as if she's it was her fault that she was murdered. And although I don't believe that the videos I've made are the ones that he was referring to, I would think that if he is aware of this channel, that I would be one of the YouTubers that he would say are on his family's side. I sort of want you to know that this is up here because I felt that these murders were an opportunity, despite the horror of it all, an opportunity to make it known that there are these people who hide their true motives, and that they're very dangerous. And I made all of these videos. I've made a lot of videos about Chris Watts, and I made them because I noticed that so many people were blaming Cheryln for her own murder, and it was an opportunity that was really being missed, you know, for people to learn about the red flags of these kinds of people, and also for victims of narcissistic abuse to feel validated that no, this wasn't in their mind. You know, having a victim blamed in front of them is of course extremely invalidating. So I wanted to undo some of that damage as best I can with, you know, making people aware of what covert narcissism is, and explaining that yes, it does exist. Someone can seem really nice and they're not showing their true colours. One of the first things that Chris Watts talks about is the petition that people were signing to have the photos of his family, of his two girls, Bella and Cece, and Cheryln, his wife, to have them removed from his cell. So what he says is, yes, that petition really blew my mind, that people really want to make me suffer like that. Even if they did ever take my pictures, they can't take my memories. So I thought this was interesting because of the way he says it blew his mind that people would want to make him suffer in that way. Partly because it's just all about him, and you know, he doesn't think of it as trying to protect them even in their death from him. He thinks of it as people wanting to be nasty to him. It's all about him, which is something that we've seen all the way along really, and I've talked about quite a lot in previous videos. Another thing that I thought was really interesting about that is the way that it blew his mind that anyone would want to make him suffer. You know, what are they thinking? I think that shows the kind of deluded world Chris Watts lives in, and the way that he is so used to people thinking well of him because he had his mask on for all these years, certainly in the public or when he met people at the beginning of relationships, and so he just can't imagine why anyone would turn on him. He believed in his mask. You know, and narcissists do. They believe that mask is them as well. So I've spoken in previous videos about when somebody who is a narcissist, when they lie, are they actually lying, or are they deluded? And I think it's a mixture of both. So they know when they're lying, but at the same time they buy into the mask that everybody else buys into. And that's why people do buy into it, because it's so realistic, because the person believes it really is them. So in this case, he's so used to coming across as this really nice guy that he can't understand why anybody would want to punish him. He starts talking about the night he killed his family, and he says, when I finished putting the girls to bed, I walked away and said, that's the last time I'm going to be tucking my babies in. I knew what was going to happen the day before and I did nothing to stop it, ! And to me, this sounds like he's saying that something was going to happen that had nothing to do with him, but he didn't stop it. Because, you know, of course, in reality, he was going to do something. So it wouldn't make sense to say, I was going to do something and I didn't stop it from happening. That doesn't make sense, you know. So he's seeing this and he's presenting it as if this is completely outside of himself and of his own control. I knew that this event was about to take place and I didn't try and stop it. So that's again Chris Watts trying to put the blame outside of himself. And I think the reason he's so open now about so much of what happened is because he is now quite comfortable with the idea that that this was an outside force, this was an evil force, the devil, that took control of him, and it really had nothing to do with him. It was just, he was just confused, and he followed what this evil spirit was telling him to do. And I'll talk a bit more about that further on in the video. But I think that, you know, this is now his new mask, which is this God-loving person who only wants to do good in the world and teach everything that he's learnt from reading the Bible to others who might need it. He talks about how he might in the future become a chaplain. So he is presenting this mask that I think he is himself believing in, that now he's a completely different person to who he was before. And so for that reason, there's no shame about talking about what happened, because it's got nothing to do with him, you know. And this again is something I've talked about in previous videos, about how he talked about what happened as if it was somebody else doing it. Now when he talks about what happened, it actually helps to include all of the detail about just how terrible it was and how horrific it was, because it just illustrates his point that the devil was doing this and not him. You know, he was just this naive person who accidentally followed the wrong spiritual guide. He says, I had literally taken my kids to a birthday party, played with water balloons, had an amazing time, sung songs all the way home, gave them bath and shower, ate dinner, read bedtime stories and sang bedtime songs, and still nothing registered. So what I take from that is that he knew this was going to be the end of their lives, and he wanted to make the most of it. He wanted to enjoy them, singing songs with them and so on. That's getting the most narcissistic supply from them, you know, because they're going to show their enjoyment of him if they're singing songs with him and all the rest of it. And it's his last go at being dad and just enjoying that role. And if he had any kind of conscience whatsoever and knew what he was about to do, he couldn't possibly have done any of that. He couldn't have enjoyed their company and enjoyed singing songs with them, playing games with them, or, you know, reading to them or anything like that, because he would have been filled with the horror of what he was going to do. And then of course it's questionable as to whether anyone would be capable of what he did with a conscience. And I don't believe they would have been, because this wasn't something that happened in the heat of the moment. It was something that was planned, premeditated murder of all of his family. He goes on to say, when Shanann had to be somewhere, I always enjoyed taking the girls places or playing outside because it was our opportunity to bond. And still the night before, I couldn't stop myself from what I knew would occur the next morning. So when he talks about how it was his opportunity to bond, obviously that doesn't make sense, does it? If you're about to kill someone, then, there's no bigger betrayal than planning to end someone's life. So that's not going to be bonding in any real sense, but he's oblivious to that because he doesn't understand what it means to bond with someone in a genuine way. It's a bit like a child who has to take his toys to the dump, in order to get a better toy. And so, but he's just making the most of his last night playing with the toys. That's all there is to it. Chris Watts talks about dropping Oxycontin into Shanann's drink. He contradicts himself a bit and says that he did it only when they were in North Carolina, but then another time he says that he did that the night that he murdered her and that he did it twice. But anyway, either way, I think what's important here is that he says that he did it because he thought it would be easier to be with Nicole if Shanann wasn't pregnant. So that shows a sort of feeling of ownership. Really, she's being treated like an animal, and not an animal that's loved, an animal for his own, that's there for his own purposes, by trying to make sure she miscarries by drugging her drink. And it's interesting as well that he says he just thinks it would be easier to be with Nicole that way. I think that the reason he murdered his family is that it was just easier if they were out of the way, because he'd found his new source of supply in Nicole Kessinger. And I talk about what supply means in another video, in the video called Why Chris Watts Killed His Family, or Chris Watts Why He Killed His Family. But anyway, and some of this is in more detail in that video. But just the way he says that it would just be easier to be with Nicole if Shanann wasn't pregnant. That's probably true. Nicole Kessinger didn't want to ideally be with somebody who already had children. But what's interesting is that it's really as simple as that. A lot of people have been trying to find, a complex reason for why Chris Watts killed his family. They've been thinking there must have been so much behind it. There must have been so much that must have built up inside for so long in terms of, having some kind of breakdown or something. But in reality, it really is as simple as that his family were in the way. And so it was just easier if he got rid of them. I think it also shows that he's never had a real relationship with any of them. And then he starts to talk more about that night. He says that he went into the girls' rooms one by one, first Bella's and then Cece's, and that he smothered each one of them and killed them. And then he says that after I left Cece's room, then I climbed back in bed with Shanann and our argument ensued. So the fact that it's telling us that he had already killed his children when he argued with Shanann, that just reinforces really, I guess, what I've said in previous videos about how the argument that he had with Shanann was not any kind of reason to have killed her. It was what he wanted to do in order to discard her in every sense of the word, because not only is he killing her, but he's making sure that he kills their relationship, while she's still alive. And in the video called Chris Watts, Why He Killed His Family, I quoted Jackson Mackenzie from Psychopath Free saying how when a narcissist discards someone, they do it in the most brutal way possible. I can't remember the exact words. I think he said that it was the most heartless way possible. And with somebody who, you know, with a sociopath or a psychopath, that's taken to an extreme. By doing that, it means that that it's easier for them to end the relationship because they are stopping themselves from ever being able to go back. If they discard someone really brutally, it's going to be a lot harder to try to mend that relationship. And of course, by killing someone, well, it's impossible for him to go back. So it means he doesn't have to regret his decision. And you know, it's really, again, just as simple as that. He's going from one source of narcissistic supply to another one, and he's holding on to the new one, and letting the other one completely go. The last thing he wants is to question himself, because that means he has to then feel vulnerable. And a narcissist is not able to cope with being vulnerable. That's the whole reason as to why they have developed into a narcissist. By telling Shanann that he didn't love her and he didn't want to be with her anymore, he could watch her face, he could watch how she responded to that. He could get his narcissistic supply from causing this big emotional reaction that he would have seen. So he would have got narcissistic supply then. He would have felt really powerful and in control and validated, you know, that as a person. And then when he killed her, of course, he would have felt that even more, as I believe he would have done with his children. I've said in the previous video, in actually a few previous videos about this, that I feel that he killed his family in a rage, and I've explained that I don't mean the kind of rage that we normally talk about. I don't mean a sort of out of control rage. I mean a rage that is deep inside him, that's behind everything really that he does, all of the manipulation, all of the good guy act, and all of the horrendous treatment of his family. You know, it all comes down to the same rage that he feels towards the world, really. And you know, I talk in other videos about why narcissists have this kind of rage that stems from their childhood. But when he was discarding his mask and he was telling her that he didn't love her and so on, and killing her, that rage would have been at the surface. And he does say that, you know, his children, it turned out, were not dead. I mean, he says that he'd already killed them. I don't believe that. I think that he must have, if he did smother them, then they must have just been unconscious and they since woke up. And when they came into the room, he says that his first feeling was anger, that they were still alive. And so that makes sense that that he was angry the whole time. He was unleashing his anger when he killed them. He wasn't having to hide it anymore. And the fact that they were still alive was just a massive inconvenience, because he thought that he'd finished the job. When he talked about killing Shanann, he said, "Isn't it weird how I look back and what I remember so much is her face getting all black with streaks of mascara?" And I think that's interesting, because the main thing that stands out to him is that it was surreal. It's this feeling of, oh, that's unusual. This is weird, you know, this is new to me. I can't believe this is actually happening. That all of that sort of vibe comes with a statement like that. So he doesn't feel, you know, a sadness or a horror himself, or fear or pain or any of those things. He feels that it's surreal. So it's a very distant, unemotional reaction to what was going on. And then he says, all the weeks of me thinking about killing her, and now I was faced with it. He'd been planning this for so long, now it's actually happening. Wow, I can't believe this is actually happening. Again, that's the feeling he's giving us. And then he says, when she started to get drowsy, I somehow knew how to squeeze the jugular veins until it cut off the blood flow to her brain and she passed out. Again, so he's giving us the details, and it sounds like no one's home. It sort of sounds almost like there's a robot talking to us. You know, there's no feeling behind it. And when he says that he somehow knew how to do it, I get a feeling of, you know, almost a kind of pride in it, that somehow he knew that this is the best way to do what he was doing. So again, the focus is on him. So even though he's describing this action, which is obviously about someone's death, you know, you would think that they would be in the spotlight, but no, again, he's in the spotlight. The fact that actually he knew what he was doing, he somehow just knew. So, you know, again, he's the main focus in his mind. And then he says, I knew if I took my hands off her, she would still keep me from Nikki. They asked me why she couldn't fight back. It's because she couldn't fight back. Her eyes filled with blood as she looked at me, and she died. I knew she was gone when she relieved herself. Those details, for most people who read something like that, you know, it's you're going to have you're going to feel emotion. How can you not, you know, when you read something like that? It's extremely detailed and very visual, the moment that someone's dying. And you just get this sense that there's absolutely no emotion. So all this time later, when he's talking about how no one can take his memories of his family, actually there's no change though. It's not like now he's seeing things differently. There's still no emotion. He doesn't talk about any emotion when he describes what happened. I think that someone who did feel emotion about watching that would probably not write the detail, because they'd be so caught up in the emotion of how that made them feel that would be much more relevant than what they were seeing. Whereas he's talking about every detail as if he is just watching it on TV, you know, and he's just seeing it again from a distance. Then he says, the girls were just kind of running around the house and watching me with scared looks on their faces. Bella started to cry, and when she did, Celeste started whimpering. What a nightmare this was. And the nightmare, I believe, was not about his children suffering. You know, the nightmare was that his children, who had so far always only seen his mask, were seeing him now, and he just wasn't prepared for that. You know, he hadn't planned for that. They weren't supposed to be seeing any of this. How awkward. Bella looking at him in a scared way. I don't get the sense that there's any emotion about how she's doing. It's more just the way that he's being perceived. It makes me think of someone who is dating someone and they've tried to end it, but the person never got the text message, and they come to meet them, you know, expecting them to be really loving, and then there's this really awkward situation of, oh, you're expecting something else from me, and now you can see how I really feel, and I thought we got this out of the way. I didn't think I'd have to actually see you go through and, you know, have to deal with this situation. He said his overwhelming feeling was that he was mad that they were still alive. So again, it's anger that you get from him. He's angry. He thought that this job was dealt with and over with, and here it is again right in front of him. And not only that, but Bella's scared expression and the fact that both of them are crying is reflecting back who he is. And so that's going to bring up shame. And so when a narcissist feels shame, it makes them angry, and they project that shame onto the people that are bringing that feeling up in them. And so that's why they have contempt for people. And so, you know, now that the children are reflecting back who he really is, that's going to bring up an angry feeling in him. I'm going to leave it here and continue in the next video to go through this letter. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.